if you don't know who I am, my name's Glenn. I try to help Joe around here with some of these things. I'm not been around as long as Wesley and all the other guys, but I'm trying to learn. And so Joe's out of town right now. He's in Georgia seeing one of his kids, so he asked me to do this. And basically, I read through some things in the Bible and then some current event stuff that I'm pretty interested in. And I love history and I like politics. I try to mix these things together to give you a lesson, okay? So, recent historical events that's happened in another country, not ours, but another country. And these events have a pretty miraculous connection. So how we're going to connect that to the Bible is going to be 2 Kings chapter 19. The Bible tells us of a miracle God performs for Jerusalem. It's during this time that the Assyrian army had conquered everybody they had aimed their forces at. Jerusalem had been split into different parts, and the northernmost section of Jerusalem was now to be attacked by the Assyrians. King Hezekiah knows how bad things are about to get. Even though he has his own fighters and everything else, he knows he's no match for what the Assyrians are going to do to him. So, knowing that he's going to be destroyed in the Assyrians' attack, Hezekiah does the only thing a leader can do in the true times of despair. He walks outside of his palace, changes into a sackcloth to basically break himself down and make himself more pure, and he goes to a sacred place and he prays to God. Please save Jerusalem and save all of God's people. Not only did God save Jerusalem, he also destroyed the leader of the Assyrian army. Hezekiah, being the good follower and leader that he was, gave God all of the credit and the glory. So now we're going to bring this into a current event that's happened. Has anybody been watching anything about El Salvador lately? Anybody know anything about that?
I don't know a lot of them coming across the board.
Not quite, but okay, that's good. So when you go to El Salvador is basically, the name of El Salvador means the Savior, right? Spanish. So El Salvador was a Central American country that was considered to be an ally of the U.S. since the Cold War. During the 80s, our CIA backed and trained several El Salvadorian guerrilla fighters to combat against the Sandinistas. Does anybody remember the Iran-Contra conflict we had in the 80s? Old Reagan got in a lot of trouble for. So, basically, communism had gained a foreign influence, and our CIA went in and started affecting their country, doing some things it probably should have done. The country ends up going in a really bad downhill slide. You have human rights violations such as child soldiers being made to fight, authoritarian rule where everybody was scared to do anything unless the government made them do it or allowed them to do it. And eventually the U.S., when they were done with El Salvador, would bomb this country to prevent a change in their governmental ruling party. So basically, once we got through, right before the Iran-Contra stuff had happened, we didn't like the people that were going to vote into power, so we bombed them and got them out. We ended up having a proxy war with them. And this proxy war not only destroyed El Salvador, but it would also end up coming across our border and destroying parts of South Central LA and the black middle class communities that live there. If you guys don't know, we finally, through a bunch of investigation stuff, CIA has finally admitted that he actually trafficked cocaine into South Central LA as a way of gaining money to pay for this war, because Congress wouldn't allow Reagan to pay for it with standard government process funds. So they end up selling arms to Arab countries, taking the money, running it through a channel, buying weapons, sending them down to the Sandinistas, and trying to fight a war. So the worst part it did for us is every time we go somewhere to another country and we get involved in how they operate, it tends to be always worse on us in the long run. So one of the side effects of the CIA getting admitted, or it has admitted to what they've done, is they introduced crack cocaine into LA, and Los Angeles was actually a pretty good city. And when you put into the effect of everything that we did around them, like in Compton and South Central, it destroyed their town. So the conflict and the coup in El Salvador would lead to a mass exodus of natives. That's where you see the people coming across the border. They no longer want to live there anymore, right? So 1/3 of their country would go all the way through Mexico to restart their lives in the U.S. They left a terrible economy in their wake with no jobs, crime rates super high, murder rates were the highest in the Western Hemisphere, next to Haiti. Haiti is a pretty bad place still. So what once was a beautiful place to live, raise kids, became a nightmare where all natives wanted to flee. El Salvador got so bad that by 2015, the murder rate was 107 people per 100,000. So in that year, they had 6,657 people die. If you take their population and compare it to our population, it would be the same as if we had 388,325 people murdered in 1 year. The place was really bad. How did the murder rate get so high in El Salvador? The El Salvadorians that fled their country and went to LA had no jobs, no ID, no way of making money, but they knew they could sell drugs because that's what they'd seen in their native land. So when they get to LA and they try to sell drugs, parts of LA is already controlled by the Mexican cartel and says, hey, this is our territory, not your territory, get away. This is where we sell our drugs. So eventually, those group of El Salvadorians would find a place in LA they could sell drugs. The place they ended up selling was known as 18th Street. 18th Street drug sales would eventually lead to a gang called the 18th Street Gang. We now know them more because they've gotten far more notorious and far more sadistic as being known as MS-13. If you guys know anything about MS-13, they're a really bad group of guys. So the gangs got meaner, more sadistic. Eventually, they even turned to satanic actions. As recently as just 2 months ago, somebody was truly sacrificed, just like a satanic ritual would be, but our media will not cover it and tell us about it. They keep us looking at different things. So during the 90s, Bill Clinton takes over as our president. He's going to clean up LA. So he goes in there and starts arresting all the El Salvadorian people that were selling drugs, and he deports them, which for us seems like a great thing, right? Get them out of our country. We want our country clean. The problem with that is when he sent them to El Salvador, he never told the people in El Salvador why he arrested them. He just tells them, hey, they're illegal immigrants. They don't need to be in our country. You guys need to take them back. So little does El Salvador know, they're taking the meanest, worst people they can possibly let back into their country. These guys were living in our country, ruling as a mafia type, intimidation of people. Now they go back to their homeland with a lot less people and they implement the same rules and they destroy the country. How bad does it get? One report I read said that most business owners in El Salvador claimed a 25% tax deduction on their taxes for extortion money they paid the gangs to keep them out of their business. If you wanted your doors open, you paid the gang just like you paid anything else. When asked why they were allowed to do the deduction, they said it was the government's job to keep it safe, and if they have to pay for it, they should get it off their taxes. I can't really argue with them on that one, but at one time it was said that 3% of the country's GDP was going just to support gangs to keep them out of people's houses. Living conditions there would get worse and worse. Various politicians would always run on the promise of reducing crime, only to later be found caught up in another scandal associated with the gangs. They tried multiple times to do negotiations with them. Can we give you part of the country and you give us part of the country, and we'll leave you alone and you leave us alone, which is not going to work because they need money. So when they run out of their own money, they're going to the good people's side and trying to shake them down and get the money. But anyway, gangs end up get their payouts and try to give them payouts, give them to quit killing citizens. Crime would always end up rising again. Then in 2019, now we're tying it back to the Bible, just so you know. I know I'm long-winded. In 2019, Nayib Bukele would become president. His presidential campaign would use popular slogans such as "There's enough money when nobody steals" and "Return what was stolen to our country." Bukele would constantly have to switch political parties because as the existing government knew how popular he was, they would go and cancel the political parties he was running with to keep him from running for president. So basically, if Bukele comes out and says, I'm a Democrat, 2 days ago before election, cancel that party. You're no longer a legitimate person. So they scrambled. They signed up for another political party. 2 hours ago before the 12 a.m. election filing, cancel that party. But he finally got in with just a few minutes to go. He gets in, he runs. He ends up winning with a 53% of the popular vote. As he ran his campaign with a promise to end gang violence, his plan that he had implemented with his cabinet was called the Territorial Control Plan. It was a bunch of steps where they would step out and implement this policy, try to curtail the gangs and take their country back. First time they implemented the first stage, gangs violently lashed out that night and killed 87 people. If you convert that 87 people to our population, it's just as if we went to bed at night and woke up with 5,046 people murdered while we slept, or 2 9/11s if you want to do the math. It was then that Bukele felt like Hezekiah. Fighting an army that wanted nothing but to destroy El Salvador, Bukele gathered his cabinet and they did something that U.S. leaders no longer do. They prayed. They prayed for God to stop the killings. After his cabinet held hands and prayed, and he's very vocal about this, not another murder happened in their country due to the gangs, the problems. Still people get randomly killed, but it's not the guerrilla type stuff that was going on. They prayed to help El Salvador stop the crime and terror. With God's grace, things have gotten way better. Now El Salvador has a lower crime rate than the U.S. and is now the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. 5 years, that's all it took. 30% of El Salvador population that once fled to our country has now asked, can they please come back? Because they want to be led by a man that actually prays and makes good decisions. All the while, even when you look up his name, and he's doing a bunch of interviews right now because he's pretty popular because everybody wants to know how he stopped the crime. He tells everybody, do you want the official way I did it, or do you want the real reason or the real way I did it? And he says the official reason takes me like 2 pages. I'll show you, it's a bunch of steps. But the real reason is we had a miracle. We all sat down, prayed, held hands, and God fixed our country. Now, I want to throw a little bit extra history in this. We've all heard phrases when we were in school, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. So we knew if we didn't take our test and pass our classes, we were all going to have to repeat that history lesson. But we have a lot of things going on right now as far as current events that are kind of cycles of what's already been. So I'm going to start with some of those. We currently have multiple generations of kids and young adults who feel our economic system doesn't work for them and won't keep their money safe. Same thing we saw happen in the 30s and 40s with the great stock market crash. And I know as an older person, some of you guys are older than me, we all look at these kids and go, they won't work, they won't do nothing, what's wrong with them, we'll never get anywhere. But in a kid's defense, if I had a college educated and I just got out of school and I make more money starting than I ever thought I could, say I make $100,000 a year starting salary, which we know is not really happening, right? But let's say you made $100,000. You would think that a college graduate kid in this world making 6 figures could go out and buy them a house, right? Pretty simple, a starter house. Well, your basic rule of thumb on finance is whatever you make a year, you multiply times 3, that's kind of how you can buy. So this kid, if he has no other bills, can buy him a brand new $300,000 house. Only problem is starter houses are starting now at $350,000 to $400,000. So here's a kid that did everything he's supposed to do. He can't even get into the system that we're in. So, and I'll rant a little bit, but I'm sorry, but I got to explain something. Right now, if you watch the news, every superpower except us is becoming allies. Last time this happened, we had to go to Europe and fight a little guy that got really mad at the world. This is 30 or 40s, World War II. We're constantly told by the media to hate Russia without explaining what we've done to make them angry. And in truth, we've all grown up. I think we're all of a decent age here. None of us have ever been raised to have compassion towards Russia, right? They're the big red people. They're mean. They're not as smart as us and everything. So when I start researching this, I start looking into Russia. And there's some stats, while I don't want to be a Russian, there are some things Russia has done to help us, help the U.S. So in World War II, we needed bodies to go fight in Europe because a lot of my grandfather and some of you guys' dads and grandfathers, they went and fought in European campaign, but a lot of them went to the Pacific campaign to fight, and we needed bodies. Russia did not hesitate to give us all the people they could give us. To the point that when Germany invaded Russia, they destroyed 1/3 of their country. If you'll take that 1/3 mark and lay it on top of the U.S., imagine everything from the East Coast where we live completely destroyed past the Mississippi River. No buildings, no infrastructure left. Russia went right through it, dealt with it, and started again. Now we are all told to hate them. They're mean, bad people. I also am not a fan of Putin, but I do believe the guy asked us to let him join NATO because he was tired of having, when he took over Russia, Russia's not in good shape. It doesn't make a lot of money. They're in bad. When Russia dies or the US, Soviet Union goes under in like 89 to 91, they don't have any money. And they certainly can't take what little money they've got to spend on defense of themselves against the U.S. So he asked, can I join NATO? Therefore, I don't have to play this crazy Cold War game you guys have been making me play. And every president that he asked, Clinton, Bush the second, and Bush the first too. Every one of them said, absolutely great idea. This will be a historic day. 2 days later, after they come back home, they would call them and tell them, I talked to my people, so you can't join. So somehow when you got it back to Washington, Washington changed their mind. Why? My personal belief is we're not going to do anything that doesn't help support the war machine because that's what they're all driven by. All right, let's get to the next one. Sorry, I'm going to rant. We now hate people for the color of their political team. We now want to know, are you red or are you blue? Back in the 50s and 60s, we had the civil rights movements and people hated people because of the color of their skin, but somehow that's not enough anymore. We now have to hate you for what team you think you can be a part of. When in all honesty, neither one of them leads the country. We're all fighting over a hall monitor in the middle of the game. We now have nuclear warships parked out in Cuba, just like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s. Did anybody remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? People tell you about it or whatever, right? Every day, that's all they could talk about. When you're in school, get ready. You need to duck under the table. We're going to have a nuclear attack. Has anybody even heard anything about this on the news? There's 11 warships parked between Miami, Florida, on the coast of Cuba, and this stock it's nothing. If we ever get to the part of having a nuclear conflict, we are all done. It's not that they're going to aim it at Fort Bragg and we live near Fort Bragg. Life on Earth's gone. It's over with. And if you did survive, you don't want to survive. All right. We're now funding a war and fighting a war that we cannot win, that is destroying our economy and killing hundreds of thousands of Ukraine citizens. Now, Ukraine citizens is a little different, but when we went to Vietnam, we had Johnson and everybody else so bent on fighting that war, they didn't care if it took every one of our sons or, you guys are older than me, but U.S. sons to die for the war and all the money that we lost. We now have a president that our government hates so bad, they are willing to weaponize the very departments of the government that's supposed to work for the people and aim them to him to do nothing but hurt him. Trump's a unique individual. He's pretty narcissistic. I don't think he's the savior of the world. I hope he helps. I hope he does what he's supposed to do. But this whole situation is very reminiscent of Kennedy in the 60s. Once Kennedy started making independent decisions that did not go with the government, he magically didn't leave Dallas. Interest rates are rising. The economy's getting weaker, just like it did in the 70s. Some of you guys, I'm sure, remember the gas crisis of the 70s and how bad things got. And then by seems like 1979, 1980, if you got a home mortgage that was under 20%, you were high-fiving your neighbor about how good you got over on the banks. And now we're mad that we got to pay 7 and 8% for a loan, which we shouldn't have to in some ways. But anyway, we'll get to that later. We now have a drug epidemic caused by the government. You can't afford the medicine that you need because of insurance and healthcare has turned into a for-profit scam. We have borders that allow fentanyl into the country that are left wide open by our government. We also had a war that was supposed to fight this called the War on Drugs in the 80s, which nothing about it resembled a real war. Had no success. I'm going to end it like this. It seems like we have heard a lot of these stories before. We will someday have leaders. Hopefully someday we will have leaders who can put their egos aside and pray for God to give us the miracles that we desperately need to survive in this world like Hezekiah did. One thing I do like about President Bukele is the first thing he says anytime is the reason his country is successful is because they were willing to pray to God to help them because they couldn't fight it on their own. And sadly, we have nobody in our race to pick from that I think could do anything like that, but we'll see. So thank y'all for coming. I hope something I said worked or rung a bell, maybe. If not, thanks for letting me speak. And yeah.
This past week, there's an archaeologist that was studying satellite imagery, and they found evidence of the Assyrian encampment when 160,000 were what you were talking about, the story, where the Lord, woke up. The Israelis woke up one morning, looked out, and all these armies, there was nothing out there but dead bodies. So they found these encampments and stuff. So
And they still have all of it's archaeological dig. I read some on it.
Pretty interesting.
It is. The one thing, like a lot of people that don't believe in God, those people, they always have every excuse in the world to disprove why the Bible's not right, or why it's not written right, or it's contradictive and everything else. And it's amazing that everything over time that we find can get linked back to the Bible.
Amen.
So for us, I love science. I just grew up, I was a nerd, loved it to death. And so they teach us in school this Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is how the government got started, or how the universe got started. They couldn't understand that God just flipped a switch like a big bang and it started. Like, I don't see how these aren't related, but for some reason they wouldn't admit that they were related. But as time goes on, they're realizing that everything that they're finding out actually has a biblical relationship back to it. So
the sad thing, though, all of us that are waiting to find archaeological proof of what the Bible says, we don't accept God on the proof. We accept God on faith. And if you're waiting for proof, you're going to hell. Because you got to accept them on faith.
Wesley, I was told one time that God wants you to believe, but he also understands you are going to ask questions along with your belief. Is that true, or have I got that confused in my head?
I ain't heard a word.
Okay. Well, forget what I just said. I'll edit that part out. It don't matter. I think just as people, we want proof of everything. The same reason why when your mama told you growing up, don't put your hand on the hot stove. Why? And what do we all do? Oh, she's right. It is hot. That was a hot stove.
That's what it takes.
But we're supposed to have that same type of faith the rest of our life, and it just doesn't always play through that way, does it? We falter. Anybody else got anything they want to ask or say? I appreciate y'all coming out. Thank y'all for listening to me. Hopefully they'll let me do this again someday. So